If you run a home service business and you're using Jobber, then you're probably tracking your invoices on the Jobber platform. But what if you need to track your invoice data outside of Jobber? This is where things start to get complicated. To automatically move our invoice data from Jobber to wherever we're tracking this information, we need to use automation tools. So today, we're gonna connect Jobber with Google Sheets and sync invoice data automatically. So in this video, you're gonna learn how to automate Jobber invoice creation along with syncing information automatically to the invoice in Google Sheets, such as the invoice due date, its status, a link to the Jobber invoice page, and the Jobber invoice PDF. And as a bonus, I'm gonna show you how you can log Jobber payments in Google Sheets as well. And with that said, we have a tutorial to cover, so let's jump into it. Here we have our Jobber invoice log, and it's made up of 3 worksheets. We have our invoice overview, which is going to store basic information about our invoice. Then we have a worksheet for invoice line items, which is going to store the line item information that relates to our primary invoice in the invoice overview worksheet. Then we have our payments worksheet, which is simply going to track the payments that relate to the primary invoice. For invoice overview, we're tracking information like the Jobber invoice URL, the invoice number, invoice status, invoice ID, the client name, service dates, issue date, invoice due date, billing address. We have the property address, a subtotal, tax, invoice total, total payments, invoice balance, and invoice PDF. For invoice line items, we're simply tracking the primary invoice number, the description of the line item, the quantity of the line item, the unit price, total price. And for payments, we're tracking the invoice number, the payment date, the payment amount, and the URL to the receipt. This app triggers whenever a new invoice is created in our Jobber account, and then it takes that invoice information and it adds it as a new row in our invoice overview worksheet here in Google Sheets, and that's this worksheet. And because a Jobber invoice can have one or multiple line items, we need to loop through the line items accordingly here in step number 5 in order to add them as individual rows in our invoice line items worksheet. And that is this worksheet right here. And then we need to format the issue date and the service date using a date that's provided by Jobber. And specifically, we're using the issue date and we're formatting it accordingly. Then, because Jobber doesn't natively provide a subtotal in its invoice data, we need to create a subtotal. So we do that by subtracting the taxable total from the invoice total to create this variable, which is then added in step number 4 to the invoice overview. So now that our Zap is live, let's go ahead and test it. We have a few jobs that are created in our Jobber account right here. So the first one we're going to test is Daniel test. Daniel needs a gutter installation, and we have 3 line items in this job. We can see them right here and their prices for a total amount of $4,000. So we'll go down to the billing section right here and click on new invoice. From there, we're going to set an issue date, which is also going to be the date of service. And we're going to choose 28th for this. We can see the 3 line items from the job, 2,000, 1,000, and another 1,000, adding up to a subtotal $4,000, a taxed amount of $280, and for a grand total of $4,280. So from here, we just need to click on Save Invoice. And that's what's going to trigger our Zap, and is going to add the invoice to our Google Sheet file here off to the right in the Invoice Overview worksheet, and it will add the line items accordingly. So we can see here that the Zap triggered, Jobber invoice URL is blank, but later on it will be populated because we have another Zap that handles that. We have the invoice number, which is 1. We have the status, which is draft, and we have client name, Daniel test, service date and issue date. Remember that it's going to take the issue date and it's going to use it for both service date and issue date. Invoice due date is blank, but we have another Zap that's going to populate that, and we'll show you that. Billing address and property address are populated. And if you look through subtotal, tax, invoice total, you'll notice that all of these values are correct. We have $4,000 for subtotal, we have $280 for tax, and we have a grand total of $4,280. Now we're also going to be tracking payments, and we have a Zap that tracks our payments, and we'll show you that as well. And we're keeping tab also of the overall invoice balance, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So you can see here that the line items right here in this worksheet, we had 3 line items, and they were all added to the invoice line items worksheet. So let's go ahead and let's just go through this process for a few more jobs, just so you can see it in real time. So the next one we're going to test is going to be Roger test. Roger needs a roof installation. It's just a single line item for an asphalt shingle roofing system for $8,000. So let's go ahead and do the same thing. We'll create an invoice, single line item, and let's go to a third job right here. Let's go down to Mike test. Mike needs a siding installation. We have 2 line items here that you can see, total of 7,000, and same thing. We'll just create this invoice. Let's go back to invoice overview. We can already see that the second invoice was already added here at the top. And let's go ahead and let's just save this invoice. And we can see here that the third invoice was added. So let's take a look at Roger tests just to double check. So we can actually just go to our invoices section. We'll go into Roger and let's look at the important details. So we know that the invoice number is obviously number 2, but let's just make sure the financials match. So for this one right here, we had a subtotal of $8,000, tax of $560, and we see the grand total of $8,560 matches. Let's go to line items, and we can see that this was just had 1 line item, and that line item was 8,000. So we know that one's good as well. Let's go into Mike test, and Mike test would be this one right here. Looking at the financials, we can see subtotal 7,000, tax looks good too at 490, and the total of 7,490 also looks good. Let's check the line items. We had 2 line items here. And to make things a little bit easier for us, we could simply just filter based off the invoice ID. And we can see here, these are the 2 line items, and we can see that their prices match. We had 2,000 and 5,000. So the next question is, how do we get the Jobber invoice URL to populate for each of these invoices here in the Google Sheet? So by Jobber invoice URL, I'm simply referring to this unique URL right here, which if this is pasted in the browser, this is going to take us directly to this unique invoice in Jobber. So if you go back to your original Zap, you'll notice as you go through the trigger data that Jobber doesn't natively provide this URL, so we can't map it directly to our Google Sheet. Therefore, we need to come up with a creative solution. So in order to populate the Jobber invoice URL, we need to update the invoice. So click on the edit button, head on over to the URL at the top of the page, and then we're going to copy this unique ID. And this number is going to be different for every invoice in Jobber. And go to the subject line, and we're going to paste this ID. Go to the bottom and click on update invoice, and let's see what happens. And there you go. You get the unique Jobber invoice URL. And if you click this link, it takes you directly to the invoice page in Jobber. So let's do this for a few more invoices. Music. And there you can see all the URLs have been populated for each invoice. So the magic that makes this happen in the backend is this Zap right here, which triggers whenever an invoice is updated in Jobber. And then step number 2 is going to extract the invoice ID from the subject line variable in step number 1. And then step number 3 is looking at the output variable in step number 2, and it'll only continue if this invoice backend ID exists. Step number 4 is finding the existing invoice record in our invoice overview worksheet. And then step number 5 is going to update the invoice. And you can see here, we're updating the Jobber invoice URL field. We are hard coding the Jobber invoice link followed by the unique backend invoice ID. So the next thing I'm going to show you guys how to do is how can we get this invoice status and the invoice due date update for each of these invoices. So let's go into our first invoice over here. And simply, we just want to send this invoice. So we're going to click on send. And now the status is awaiting payment. And we can see here that the invoice status updated to awaiting payment and the due date has been updated to March 30th. Now let's do this for invoice numbers 1 and 2. And there you can see the invoice statuses have been updated along with their respective due dates. So here we have the Zap that handles all of this. It triggers whenever the invoice is updated in Jobber and then proceeds to format the invoice due date, and then it proceeds to format the issued and the service date. Then it will look up the existing invoice record in the Google Sheet, and then it will proceed to update it. And you can see here that we're updating the invoice status field, the service date field, the issued date field, and the invoice due date field. So the next thing I'm going to show you how to do is how to sync the invoice PDF into the Google Sheet from Jobber. So let's go into our invoices in Jobber. We're going to start with Mike, which is invoice number 3, and we're going to go into more actions and we're going to select email. Then we're going to make sure that we select the PDF option and select send me a copy. Proceed to click on send email. And then let's see what happens. And we can see here that we have the invoice PDF. We had a successful sync, and here it is. Here's the PDF. We have all the information. We have the line items. We have the financials. So we're good to go. So let's do this for the other invoices. And there you can see we have the other invoice PDF links. And all of that's done by this zap right here, which triggers whenever we receive a new invoice email from Jobber. And then the zap will only continue if this email contains the invoice attachment and it matches a specific subject line, because without this filter, the zap will error out. Then we proceed to extract the invoice ID and proceed to upload the invoice PDF in Google Drive. Then we look up the invoice in our Google Sheet file and then proceed to update the invoice accordingly with the invoice attachment data. And here we can see in step number 6 that we're updating the invoice PDF field with our alternate link, which is the link of the invoice that was uploaded to Google Drive. So we sent our invoices to our customers, and now it's time to collect payment. So I'm going to show you how we can log Jobber payments here in this Google Sheets in the payment worksheet whenever they are collected in Jobber. So let's click on collect payment, and we're just going to collect a payment of $500 for the Daniel test invoice. So we're going to click on save an email receipt and click on send me a copy. Then click on send email. Then let's see what happens. So we could see here in Jobber that we have the payment of $500, and if we look at the payment that was logged in our Google Sheet file, we'll see that it relates to the invoice number. So we have invoice number 1, we have the date of payment, which is February 28th, and then a payment amount of $500, which is exactly what we put. And then we even have a link to the receipt. So if we pop that open, we have the link to the receipt. So let's make a few more payments here. So while we're waiting on that, if we go back into the Google Sheet, let's just look at our invoice. We could see that our invoice status has been updated. Why? Because we already made the final payments to bring the balance down to 0. So now this is still showing a balance of $3,780, but when the new payments get added to this worksheet, then it's going to balance out everything to 0. Let's give it a moment to see. As we can see, the second payment just came through, and there we go. Total payments are now $4,280, and now we have an invoice balance of $0. Let's check our payments, and we can see that we have all the payments logged here. We have all their receipts just in one place in our Google Sheet, exactly what we wanted. So this app right here syncs our payments from Jobber to our payments worksheet, and it triggers whenever a new payment receipt email is received in our Gmail inbox from Jobber. And it will only continue if the subject line contains receipt for payment. And that's the filter step right here. And in step number 3, we're extracting the invoice number from the body of the email. In step number 4, we're formatting the payment date. And in step number 5, we use JavaScript to extract the payment value from the body of the email. And in step number 6, we're taking the PDF attachment of the receipt and uploading it to Google Drive. And in step number 7, we're adding the payment and its receipt PDF to our payments worksheet. And here specifically, you could see that we are populating the invoice number field, the payment date, the payment amount, and the alternate link which came from the Google Drive upload file step prior. So in this tutorial, we use Google Sheets as an example, but you could use the same exact setup to push Jobber invoice and payment related data to any third-party platform, as long as that platform has a supported Zapier plugin, Make.com plugin, or an API. And with that said, what's one thing that you're trying to automate in Jobber? Drop it in the comments below. I'd love to hear more about your use case. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button. It helps more people just like you find this video. And if you haven't done so yet, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the Josh No Code YouTube channel so that you could follow us for updates and get notified whenever we have a new automation tutorial. Well, that's it for now, guys, and I'll catch you in the next tutorial.